Here we are. We're on the outer edge of California, Missouri at the Hutchison Houchin Family Cemetery. The old house up on top of the hill there is where my great-great-great-grandparents, Thomas and Lydia Hutchison, lived at the time of the 1860 census. Let's go check it out. One time this was 2 miles from town. Now, town is right across the fence. So we've got a newer marker here listing all the Hutchisons that are buried here. And then on the right is a marker for the 5 members of the Houchin family that are buried here. Here we have the marker for Carrie Houchin. She was the first wife of my great-grandfather, Thomas Franklin Houchin. Here's one of the older markers. This was for Lucy Popham. If I remember right, Lucy was a member of the Hutchison family. And then William Popham, 1814 to 1910. The old family house. There's the original marker for Mary Harris. What's left is preserved in concrete now. Third great-grandmother, Lydia Hutchison. And then Thomas Hutchison, here on the right, he was the first person buried in the cemetery in 1865. Here's the markers for the Houchin family. These are approximate locations of where they're buried. My great-great-grandfather, William. His wife, Cynthia, who was the daughter of Thomas and Lydia Hutchison. Here we have Sherman Houchin. Sherman and William D. were brothers of my great-grandfather, Thomas Franklin Houchin. They were the last two to live in the house up on the hill. A little over 169 years ago, on November 13th, 1850, Thomas and Lydia Hutchison purchased two 40-acre tracts outside of California, Missouri for $200. They built this home and created the family cemetery on one of those 40-acre tracts. Thomas Hutchison was the second of 7 children for John and Priscilla Hutchison. Lydia was the second of 8 children for George and Catherine Marsh. Thomas and Lydia Hutchison were married September 13th, 1821 in Belpre, Ohio. Belpre is on the Ohio River, across from what is now West Virginia. They had 5 children. The first 3, including my great-great-grandmother, Cynthia, were most likely born across the river in what was Virginia at the time. By the spring of 1833, they were living near Cincinnati, Ohio, where 2 more children were born. Around 1836, Thomas and Lydia, along with the children, left their home near Cincinnati. After crossing the Mississippi River by ferry, they settled in Cooper County, Missouri, which is the county just north of here. Their first grandchild was born in Cooper County in 1845, and Thomas and Lydia were still in Cooper County at the time of the 1850 census. After the death of Thomas in 1865, Lydia remained here in the home until her death many years later. Lydia's granddaughter, Bird Dixon, was interviewed in 1965 and shared a couple memories of Grandma Lydia. Lydia was Pennsylvania Dutch with a distinct accent that was very difficult to understand. She smoked a clay pipe and almost always wore a black veil over her head. Lydia was known for always telling jokes, including some that weren't very nice. When Lydia died, they had her funeral here at the house, and her body was taken by wagon down to the cemetery. Lydia lived here alone at the time of the 1870 census. By the summer of 1880, William Houchin had died. Cynthia and the 4 children moved back in here to live with her mother. After Lydia passed in 1887 and Cynthia in 1894, William David Houchin and his brother Sherman remained here at the family home until their deaths in the mid-1940s. William Houchin is our oldest known ancestor on the Houchin side of the family. Most of what we know of him has been gathered in the last 20 to 25 years. According to census data, he was born in Pocahontas County, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia. His ages on the different censuses and military records narrow down his birth date to somewhere between 1823 and August of 1825. By the time of the 1850 census, William was living in Ohio, near the Ohio River, just west of Portsmouth. We know he was married in Portsmouth, Ohio, on February 13th. We've got conflicting years. It could have either been 1847 or 1851 that he was married to Margaret Schwartz. By March of 1854, William and Margaret were living in Fredonia, Iowa, and had a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Houchin. Sarah was born blind and deaf. The 1860 census lists William, Margaret, and Sarah living in Decatur City, Iowa. Decatur City is just off of I-35, about 12 miles north of the Missouri border. We know that on July 4th, 1861, Margaret gave birth to a daughter named Amanda. Based on information from Amanda's family and what we know, we believe Amanda was the daughter of a local grocer named Martin Parton and was not William's daughter. On September 23rd, 1861, William enlisted in the Civil War. On October 3rd of 1861, in Davenport, Iowa, he was mustered into service of the United States with Company C of the 11th Regiment, Iowa Volunteer Infantry. During November, the regiment traveled on a steamship down to St. Louis, and on December 23rd, 1861, a detachment of 5 companies was sent by rail to California, Missouri. We assume that William's company was one of those 5. William was ill frequently during the winter and spring and was discharged for disability on June 7, 1862, in Jefferson City. A month later, William and Cynthia Hutchison were married on July 10, 1862. They had 4 children: William David, born 1863, Sherman, born 1865, Thomas Franklin, or Frank, who was my great-grandfather, born in 1870, and 1 daughter, Daisy, born in 1876. I've seen recent information on the internet that leads me to believe there might have been another child born in 1867 that died at birth. And then we know that, based on what Frank Houchin had told his children, was that William had died when he was age 9 and he had to quit school so that he could work. So what happened to William's family in Iowa? Margaret ended her relationship with Martin Parton, and he left town by the end of 1861. The 1870 census lists Margaret and the 2 girls living at the Decatur County Poor Farm. In 1877, Amanda was married at the age of 16. The 1885 census lists Margaret and Sarah still living at the Poor Farm. We've been told that Margaret had some eyesight issues as well and may have been partially blind. Margaret tried to collect William's veteran's pension in the early 1890s. She died in 1892, and her grave marker lists her as the wife of William M. Houchin. Sarah died in 1909 and is buried in an unmarked grave next to her mother in Ottumwa, Iowa. Several newspaper articles from 1901 tell about Amanda meeting her father, Martin Parton, for the first time at age 39. One other thing I forgot to mention was that William's middle name was Myers, although he did not use that after he left Iowa. But there are several records that either have the middle initial M or the middle name Myers on it. William David Houchin was born 8.5 months after the marriage of William and Cynthia. Besides being a farmer, he was also a boxer and a one-time middleweight champion of Missouri. He performed acrobatic stunts and was rumored to have been involved in a carnival or a circus at one time. In early 1913, Will showed off his skills in a performance at the Fink Opera House in town as part of a benefit program for the Aurora Athletic Association. He was nearly 50 at the time. We don't know anything about his wife, but we do know that William had one daughter, Leola Shepard, and one granddaughter named Darlene. Will liked to run from home to Clarksburg every morning in order to keep in shape. It's about 6 miles each way. At the age of 83, William went to help in a church revival over in Latham and fell through an open trap door at the home where he was a guest. The next day, he died from his injuries. Up until his death, William had been the caretaker of the family cemetery. By the mid-1960s, the cemetery was overgrown, and many locals were not aware of its existence. Some of the family cleaned it up in the early 80s, but by the late 90s, it was once again overgrown. It was cleaned up again, and at that time, the sign and white fence were added, along with a number of the grave markers that had been missing for some of those buried there. Sherman was the second child of William and Cynthia. He had gone blind around the age of 20 after drinking a bad batch of homemade liquor. In 1906, his brother Will and a couple of Hutchison cousins petitioned to have Sherman declared a person of unsound mind, making William his legal caretaker. Sherman was a small man, only wearing size 5 or 6 shoes, and had a high, shrill voice. He loved the jug and was known to show up at his cousin's with a gallon jug and a pearl-handled pistol. The family was happy when they could recover the pistol and return him home safely. Although Sherman lived with his brother Will, he preferred to spend his time alone in a shack about 150 feet from the house. A thin wire stretched between the two allowed him to find his way back and forth. Sherman's cabin was small and had a 2-foot deep hole dug in the corner for food storage. One friend later told a story about visiting the cabin and watching a mouse take food off of Sherman's plate while he was eating dinner. The brothers were known to get into arguments, and sometimes Sherman would climb a tree. One time when he refused to come down, Will cut down the tree with Sherman in it. Every Saturday, a neighbor boy would take a long stick and lead Sherman into town. Sherman was well known around the town of California, and his funeral had a large attendance. We're about out of time today, so the stories of Frank Houchin will have to wait until another time.